The Collapse of Imperial China and the Birth of Revolution, 1895 to 1919. At the dawn of the 20th century, China stood at a historic breaking point. The Qing Dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 4 centuries, was crumbling under the weight of internal decay and external humiliation. Military defeats at the hands of Western powers and an increasingly aggressive Japan shattered confidence in the imperial system. China's losses in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1895, and the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion, 1900, forced the Qing court to accept unequal treaties, territorial concessions, and foreign economic dominance. These humiliations fueled widespread resentment among intellectuals, students, merchants, and reform-minded elites, all of whom saw the traditional Confucian order as incapable of protecting national sovereignty. Reform attempts failed, corruption deepened, and famine and social unrest spread. Out of this crisis emerged revolutionary movements calling for radical change. In 1911, the Qing Dynasty finally collapsed in the Xinhai Revolution, leading to the abdication of the last emperor. The revolutionaries, inspired by Western political models and nationalist ideas, proclaimed a republic under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen. Sun articulated the influential 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood, which promised a modern, sovereign, and socially just China. However, the dream of republican stability quickly faded. Power slipped into the hands of military strongmen, and the fragile republic fractured almost immediately. By the late 1910s, China had entered an era of warlordism, where regional generals ruled their own territories with private armies, leaving the central government weak and ineffective. Disillusionment deepened further in 1919 when the Versailles Treaty transferred former German concessions in China to Japan rather than returning them to Chinese control. This betrayal sparked the May 4th movement, a wave of student-led protests that combined nationalism, anti-imperialism, and cultural rebellion. The movement rejected traditional values and encouraged new ideological exploration, laying the intellectual groundwork for socialism and Marxism to take root in China. Warlordism, ideology, and the rise of competing visions, 1920 to 1925. By the early 1920s, China existed in name as a republic, but in reality, as a fractured battlefield. The central Beiyang government exercised little authority beyond the capital, while warlords carved the country into competing fiefdoms. Amid this chaos, new ideologies vied to define China's future. Inspired by the Russian Revolution, radical intellectuals such as Chen Duxiu and Li Dessau founded the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) in 1921. Advocating Marxist revolution as the path to national salvation. Meanwhile, Sun Yat-sen, disillusioned with Beijing politics, established a rival government in Canton and rebuilt the Kuomintang KMT into a disciplined revolutionary movement. Unable to secure Western backing, Sun turned to the Soviet Union, which provided advisors, weapons, and ideological guidance. Under Soviet pressure, the KMT and CCP formed the First United Front in 1924, temporarily setting aside ideological differences to reunify China. This uneasy alliance reflected desperation rather than harmony. When Sun Yat-sen died of cancer in 1925, leadership passed to the ambitious and disciplined Chiang Kai-shek, who assumed command of the National Revolutionary Army. Chiang was deeply suspicious of communist influence within the KMT, yet he recognized the practical necessity of cooperation, at least temporarily. China, at this moment, stood at a crossroads. Nationalism, communism, and militarism overlapped uneasily, each claiming to offer stability, unity, and resistance to foreign domination. The fragile alliance between the KMT and CCP would soon be tested on the battlefield. The Northern Expedition and the violent split of the United Front, 1926-1928, in 1926. Chiang Kai-shek launched the Northern Expedition, a sweeping military campaign designed to crush the warlords and reunify China under nationalist control. The National Revolutionary Army advanced rapidly, defeating one regional strongman after another. Yet military success intensified political tension. As nationalist troops entered major cities, communist organizers mobilized labor unions, led strikes, and expanded their influence among workers and peasants. To Chiang and his conservative supporters, business leaders, landlords, and middle-class urbanites, this appeared dangerously revolutionary. Fearing a communist takeover of the KMT itself, Chiang moved decisively. In April 1927, nationalist forces and allied gangs carried out a brutal purge of communists in Shanghai, killing thousands and effectively ending the First United Front. The CCP responded with failed uprisings later that year, but without broad worker support or sufficient military strength, they were crushed. By 1928, Chiang's armies captured Beijing, and the last major warlord Zhang Zuliang pledged loyalty. Chiang declared national unification, inaugurating what became known as the Nanjing Decade. While often portrayed as a period of peace and modernization, this era masked deep internal fractures. Chiang ruled as generalissimo, a semi-authoritarian leader who enacted limited reforms but relied heavily on military power. Land reform was blocked by elite interests, warlords retained regional autonomy, and Japanese aggression continued unchecked. Most critically, the communists were not destroyed, they had merely retreated, regrouping in China's vast countryside. Mao Zedong, Peasant Revolution, and Guerrilla Warfare, 1927 to 1934. After their defeat in the cities, the communists turned inward to reassess their strategy. Within the CCP, a fierce ideological debate emerged. Urban-focused leaders, backed by Moscow, argued that revolution must arise from industrial workers, following orthodox Marxism. In contrast, Mao Zedong believed China's future lay with its peasants, the vast majority of the population who suffered under landlord exploitation, debt, famine, and social neglect. Mao's failed autumn harvest uprisings convinced him that while peasants lacked organization, they possessed revolutionary potential. Teaming up with former warlord Zhu De, Mao formed the Red Army and established rural Soviets in remote regions such as Jiangxi. There, the communists implemented land redistribution, discipline among troops, and political education. Chiang viewed these Soviets as an existential threat and launched a series of encirclement campaigns to wipe them out. The first 4 campaigns failed largely due to Mao's innovative use of guerrilla tactics, ambushes, mobility, and popular support. Mao articulated these ideas in writings that blended Marxism with classical Chinese strategy and Western military theory, arguing that apparent weakness could be transformed into strength. However, by 1934, Chiang adopted new methods inspired by German advisors, using blockhouses and attrition warfare. The 5th campaign succeeded, forcing the communists into a desperate strategic retreat. The Long March in Mao's Ascendancy, 1934 to 1936. In October 1934, roughly 90,000 Red Army soldiers and civilians abandoned their bases and embarked on what would become the legendary Long March. Over 13 brutal months, they crossed mountains, rivers, swamps, and hostile territory while under constant attack from nationalist forces. Disease, hunger, exposure, and combat decimated their ranks. Only about 25,000 survived. Despite the staggering losses, the march proved politically transformative. During internal debates, Mao's strategic insights gained credibility, while Soviet-backed commanders lost influence. By 1935, Mao emerged as the undisputed leader of the CCP. The Long March became a foundational myth of endurance, sacrifice, and revolutionary legitimacy, cementing Mao's authority and shaping communist identity. Settling in Shanxi, the communists rebuilt cautiously, refining Mao's 3 stages of insurgency theory, which emphasized survival, mass support, and eventual counteroffensive. Yet even as civil war loomed, external threats reshaped priorities. Japanese expansion intensified, and popular anger grew over nationalist appeasement. The stage was set for a dramatic political reversal. The Xi'an Incident, United Front, and War with Japan, 1936-1937, in December 1936. Internal Chinese conflict collided with the Japanese threat in the dramatic Xi'an Incident. Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by warlord Jiang Zuoliang, who demanded an end to the civil war and a united front against Japan. After intense negotiations and likely Soviet pressure, Chiang was released. Shortly afterward, he announced a halt to anti-communist campaigns and formed the Second United Front with the CCP. Though deeply distrustful of one another, nationalists and communists now faced a common enemy. In July 1937, fighting erupted at the Marco Polo Bridge, triggering full-scale war with Japan and the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Communist forces were formally integrated into the National Army, and civil war temporarily ceased. The conflict would devastate China for 8 years, reshape global geopolitics, and ultimately pave the way for communist victory in 1949. What began as imperial collapse had evolved into revolution, civil war, and total war, defining China as turbulent 20th century and setting the stage for its emergence as a modern state.